So here we are in part 6. How stands the case? It basically boils down to a problem of limits. Here is God who has no limits. And worse, he doesn't want there to be any limits. Okay? I mean, the whole idea of creation is for God to put himself in you, Christ in you, the hope of glory, Colossians 1:25 through 27, Ephesians 4:13, the maturity of Christ. KJV gets that verse astonishingly well stated. That's God running his thoughts in you. It's cycling because you're finite, but it's still God quality, thinking, God's nature running in you. That's the whole goal. Okay, but God has no limits. See why it was so excruciating for Christ to be God and man? It made it worse, not better. Here is his whole nature. He's one person with one will, hello. Knowing full well he's God, but he has to use his human will not to peek at his deity. And yet he has to keep willing from his human will to hold the universe together in his deity. My pastor spent a lot of time on explaining that. So it's really easy for me to understand, but I understand historically, of course, that, retarded Christians, starting with the retarded church fathers, didn't understand this, and they even killed people over it. The Greens and the Blues and Constantinople and the Circus Maximus, killing themselves over this. Okay, from his human will, he knows he's God. And he has to, from his human will, choose not to look at what his deity knows. The tension. So that pattern is legated to us, except that we aren't already God. We have a similar tension, though. We have the standard of God to live by, and we can't. So you're constantly failing. You constantly know you don't measure up. Because God has no limits. But you're expected to obey at his level, which of course you can't do, but you can do finitely, moment by moment, if the Holy Spirit's running your life. That's why you need 1 John 1:9. Otherwise, the Holy Spirit's not running your life, and everything you do is doo-doo. It's not a question of morality, and it's certainly not a question of human works. Okay? It's a question of God running your soul. Just like you ran Christ's soul. And that makes your soul bigger, and it makes it harder. It makes the tension unbearable. It's unbearable to have God's standard and God's goal. And that's what you must do. And if you don't, of course, it's a sin. And if you don't, you get punished. And you can't live up to it. You can't live up to God's standard in your finite body. That's a sin nature to boot. The torture is ongoing. And you don't notice it at first as a new Christian, but you do notice it as you come to know God. Because once you know God, everything else is just not acceptable. You're not acceptable to yourself, and everybody's not acceptable to you. Suddenly, your spouse, your kids, your job, your everything is totally disgusting to you. Why? Because as you know God, the more you know him, the more only what God thinks and what God is acceptable, and everything else is disgusting, even if it's nice. If you want a trip to Tahiti, you won't enjoy it. It's only a trip to Tahiti. Whoop-de-doo. It's not God, so it's not interesting. Can you imagine what it was like for Christ to have to live down here? So this whole issue about God's personality and whether we live up to it, its limits. We are totally limited. He's totally unlimited by choice. And his standard is unlimited. And if you want God, you want to live by his unlimited standard, but you're limited, and it's a constant frustration because you can never live up to it. What you have to do is you keep on, as it were, relying on the promise that the Holy Spirit's making something out of you. Otherwise, you can't stand to take another breath once you get old enough in the spiritual life. It's the only way you can survive the next breath is to know the Holy Spirit's making something out of your life. Because you sure can't. You've long since stopped liking yourself at all. And that's why people quit. That's why people become atheists. Here's this God who's supposed to be so high, and of course we all have limits as to what we call good. And the atheist is busy saying God is immoral because God's limits about what constitutes morality are higher. Okay, God says truth must be free. Okay, that means that bad things have to be allowed to continue to exist. To the atheists and to most normal people, that's immoral. God shouldn't allow bad to exist. How many times have we all wondered that and heard it and thought about it, if we're honest? Okay, but this is why. It's not righteous if it's not free. That's what the Calvinist doesn't understand. So in his limits, God's transgressed his limits. So he straitjackets God by saying, what he says. Okay, the atheist straitjackets God in a different way. And of course, everybody misuses the Bible. But we all have our internal ideas about what good is. And God transgresses those. I mean, didn't it transgress morality to order Abraham to kill his only son? Sure it did. Yeah. And what did God do about that? Well, God can give the son back his life, and that was Abraham's reasoning, as you'll see in Hebrews 11. Okay, but he's God and I'm not. So even if God wanted something immoral, even if God wanted something that seems bad, he's God. I love him, period. And that's the test of your spiritual life, especially at the end.